Thank you so much for joining, folks. If you would like to have a piece of paper in front of you, either to take some notes or also to be able to doodle throughout the workshop, we're also going to be doing a small exercise where you reflect on yourself. And if you feel like being able to do that on paper, feel free to have that option in front of you. So my name is Heather Beglow. My background is in women's and gender studies, as well as 2S LGBTQ plus advocacy and support. So we're going to start. I'm just going to share my agenda here. I am going to do a land acknowledgement for our next slide before we get into the work. We're going to talk about relationships, including both types and styles of relationships. Some of this might seem a bit simple or rudimentary at first, but this is going to help lay the groundwork or the building blocks to us talking about the importance of different pieces of relationships. For example, we're going to talk about healthy versus unhealthy relationships. We're going to then broaden to focus on community, and we're going to consider how communities themselves could be healthy or unhealthy. We're going to shift then a little bit into talking about disability and relationships, thinking a bit about the myths that are related to disability and relationships. We're going to talk a bit about the importance of consent, and then finally, some local and international advocacy that I personally find very inspiring when it comes to this conversation on healthy relationships. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Our ability to gather is a result of the peace and friendship treaties of the 1750s and 1760s that affirm Indigenous sovereignty. And we are privileged to be able to live, work, and play on this land. As we think today about healthy relationships and communities, I would love for us to consider our relationships to one another, between nations, and with the land. So I can't, of course, delve into every single piece of this, and I wish I could, but we would be here all day. So I just want this brief reminder that healthy relationships and communities come from and are inspired by this importance of land acknowledgement, Indigenous sovereignty, and bringing us together as different nations living in the same place currently. So I want us to start talking broadly about relationships. I want you to start thinking about the different types of relationships that exist in the world. I do have a visual here for this photo if you're interested in taking a look and thinking about maybe what these different pairings could symbolize. I would love if anybody has some examples or suggestions for what different types of relationships currently exist or that we might be part of. When we think about the relationships that we have as people, there are many different kinds, and there are many different ways that we end up interacting with others. I think I've seen some things come into the chat. Caitlin, do you have anything to share from the chat so far?
Sure. So Michelle Sayers mentioned our work community.
Definitely. So work relationships is a really great example, colleague to colleague, as well as perhaps mentor to mentee. So somebody who is in a leadership position and is maybe supporting somebody who's willing to learn. I love that. Any other types of relationships that maybe come to mind for folks when we think about this?
So Carolyn Warrington also said school, sports, family.
Definitely. Yep. Lots of great examples there. Thank you so much. Romantic relationships is something that comes to mind for me. Friendships and even different types of friendship. You know, you might have a friend for one interest and then a friend where you share a different interest, right? So there might be different levels to it. Let's think about these relationships here. When we think about, you know, a boss, a coworker, mentor, family, a spouse, or perhaps romantic, as well as friendships. It's really interesting to start thinking about how these relationships are quite different from one another. And it starts to get you thinking, you know, do you act differently depending on who you're with? Are there people that you are more comfortable with in this grouping or least comfortable with, you know? Anything that came into the chat there, Caitlin? I think I might see something extra.
Yeah, so Jesse Nielsen also said that there are sometimes toxic relationships.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Jesse. It's so true. And we are going to talk about those as well, and get into some examples of how those work. Um, what I really like about thinking about these different relationships, and thinking about these questions that go along with them is that for some of us, we might have a harder time noticing those differences in levels of closeness or intimacy with others. For some folks who live with disabilities, whether that's intellectual disabilities or maybe a neurodivergency such as autism or ADHD, they might struggle with understanding those different hierarchies in social relationships. And so learning how to consider these things and how you might feel within these different pairings or groupings can really help sort of shape how you view relationships and your own needs personally. We all tend to coexist within a large variety of different relationships. And these relationships can vary by length. So whether you might have met somebody only briefly and never crossed paths again, versus somebody that you've known since the day you were born. There's proximity and closeness. So actual location. My current best friend lives in British Columbia. And so I have to consider how to support and build our friendship at a distance, and how does technology support that, but also how does it hinder the development of our friendship and closeness? The intimacy and strength of a connection. You ever feel like you meet somebody and you just click right away? And you're not really sure why. And then with some other folks, you're like, I can't get conversation going. It is just grinding to a halt no matter what I do. And this is part of this, complexity that comes with relationship building. The environment can make quite a difference. I think that we would build a different type of relationship within, for example, a workspace or a school versus maybe on a sports team. The types of goals that you work toward as a group or within those relationships might affect how you build those connections with one another. And then finally, there's also levels of hierarchy and power. And that really feeds into the one that was on the screen before, which was about relationships, for example, with your boss. So even relationships between coworkers that have the same job might be very different than between that person, the worker, and their boss, right? There's some level of hierarchy and power in there. And depending on how it's used, it could inform either a healthy or unhealthy relationship. So this is a bit of art that I really like because I find it signifies relationship, both proximity or level of intimacy, as well as time or length of relationships in a really beautiful way. So this was a piece of art in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, where the artist chose 2 lines. Each line represents one person in this pairing. And it's about how these different types of pairings affect us throughout our lives. Take a moment to look through these. Hopefully, you understand what it's symbolizing. I'm happy to answer questions if people want to ask about certain ones. If there's anything that stands out to you about this as well, I would love to hear it. Are there any that you think are particularly interesting or that symbolize a relationship in a really unique way? I'd love to know, so feel free to point that out. This is also a really interesting exercise for you to do on your own. So if this is something that you want to think through a relationship in your life, maybe a particularly important one, it might help you to visualize it in this way and to actually write on the paper where you feel those times in your life, or maybe those periods of closeness or being further apart from somebody, how those maybe would have affected you. And you might start to see some interesting patterns or ways that this has kind of affected you in life. So I think this is a really cool example, an artistic example of closeness and intimacy within relationships.
Say that I find it really powerful where the lines end, like where the different lines end depending on you know, the lifespan of the person, or like the dog one I think is really sweet because you're so close, but it's just for a really short period of time. So I think the artist did a really good job of capturing the feeling of those relationships using just lines. So thanks for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. About the parent one, because that also is very, I think, similar in that lifespan where the parent is alive for a while before the child is born, right? And then the pattern begins. So I think that's very interesting too. Thank you for pointing that out. So what are the signs of a healthy relationship? I'd love for folks to brainstorm a little. What are the signs, perhaps the things that you would see or notice, maybe things that you would hear, maybe actions that people would take that would help develop a healthy relationship? What are some signs or maybe examples that come to mind?
The opportunity for clear communication, support for one another.
In thinking about healthy relationships, I have this really lovely image here that offers some kind of nice quick points, as well as a bit of more like dimension to it. So let's get into this a bit here. For a healthy relationship to truly exist or to really come through, you would share similar values and interests, and you would create, have fun, and experience things together. There's a high level of tolerance, transparency, trust, and respect. You tend to listen to one another and you show sensitivity to the feelings and needs of each other. There are always more dimensions present in the relationship. You encourage each other to constantly improve and to achieve personal goals. The investment into the relationship is close to like 1-on-1 from each side. Essentially, you're both offering an equal amount of effort in the relationship. And you do hold each other up when times are tough. I really like this image here with healthy relationship in the center, and then these different points around it. Things like supporting and listening, respect, communication, trust, being yourself, honesty, safety, and equality. And I think all of these things are really quite important in order for a relationship to be healthy and to thrive. So let's think the opposite here for a moment. What are perhaps some ways that a relationship could be unhealthy or toxic, right? And I think when we start talking or using the word relationships, we start flipping into romantic relationships pretty automatically. So remember too that an unhealthy relationship can be romantic, but also could be an unhealthy friendship, an unhealthy family dynamic. It could be an unhealthy relationship within your workplace, with bullying, for example. So feel free not to limit yourselves. What are some signs of a relationship being unhealthy? And again, this might be something that you see or notice. Perhaps it's something that you hear, the way people talk to one another. Or maybe it's something just that you're able to, almost like a vibe. How do you see unhealthy relationships? Or what are maybe some of those signs?
You feel afraid to voice your feelings.
Fear, definitely.
And someone is controlling.
Yeah, controlling behavior, definitely. Awesome. And to talking a bit about community. So for the most part, we've been talking about one-to-one relationships. So you and a friend, or you and a romantic partner. But I want to broaden that circle a little bit. Actually seep into different forms of relationships in your life. So for example, signs of healthy relationships include things like compromise, having your own friends, supporting one another and being consistent, having your own hobbies and interests. Both people are equal, and you're giving each other compliments, support, and respect. And then when we look over here, a lot of the opposite behaviors tend to exist.
Negative physical responses like lack of sleep, eating difficulties, stress response, afraid to speak up and tell them the truth.
For a lot of us, it's really hard to trust our intuition. And our intuition is this sort of internal feeling of rightness or wrongness that's frankly really hard to teach and really hard to trust, especially when we're often taught to question it, or people try to get us to question our own reality. And so if you kind of notice that you always have a feeling of anxiety or stress around a person, if you notice you're always trying to please them, you might be having a reaction that isn't as healthy as you imagined. That can be hard to see from the outside. One of my favorite quotes is that from a TV show about healthy relationships is how, in the beginning, when you wear rose-colored glasses, all the red flags just look like flags. And I think that's a really cool way to visualize this idea that when you see these flags, you're just so excited about a person, it's hard to realize that this could eventually hurt you down the road, for example. Or even if we think about other types of relationships in our lives, if we were to think about colleagues, an unhealthy colleague or coworker relationship could form over jealousy. So it's possible that my colleague could be jealous of me for getting a certain project, and then the way they treat me might come out and affect our teamwork, right? Rather than developing a healthy communication where we're able to sort of talk about those frustrations and fears. Someone said controlling earlier, and I think that's a really important one, because whenever we talk about control, sometimes people think it's romantic, like, oh, he doesn't really want me talking to other guys, he's so sweet. That can actually be very controlling, or a behavior that kind of tries to keep somebody from living freely or living happily. It shows that they don't trust, right? And so making sure that the behaviors are coming from a place of like love, respect, and trust, and not from a place of like fear that you'll be lost to the
person might be looking at their phone and chatting with one of their friends instead of actually paying attention to their friend while hanging out with each other.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good example of, it says over here with checking Facebook and phone. I think it depends on, if you are the kind of friendship where you can just lay around and not be talking, because that's a mutual understanding that you're just going to chill out together. That's different from feeling ignored. If you're having a conversation with somebody and they're blatantly disrespecting you. Also, it can come from a controlling behavior where the person doing the controlling might be trying to check the social media or the phone of the person they want to control. So it can also be a bit of like trying to make sure they know where the person is or what updates they're putting out there, instead of, really practicing that trust. And these are all just really examples to really keep in mind as you start thinking about your own relationships. And also maybe consider ways that you might be practicing unhealthy relationships without realizing it. For example, you might have thought that a behavior that you had was romantic or loving, but maybe it turns out that it's actually a bit more controlling than you expected. And so it's a good opportunity to think, okay, how can I reframe this for myself to feel more comfortable within my relationships? To you, what is a community? What does a community, what does community mean? What is that word? Is there a definition for it?
A group of people that come together to help others. People, well, you can lean on for help, but who you can also help as well. Group of people brought together by interest or geography. A group of people with common interests, goals, or lifestyles.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, folks. You pretty much nailed that. I've got two definitions here that I like both. A group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common, and a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. As we start talking about community, I'm going to start showing how community is a very broad term and how we all are part of a lot more communities than maybe we ever truly understood before. There are a lot of different types of communities out there. For example, a sports team is a form of community. It's a group of people coming together with this common interest and common goal. There's also the LGBTQ community. For example, a group of people who all share some sort of common experience, who come together to advocate for their rights. A school could be a community. A specific classroom could be a community. So there are many different ways that people gather and come together and create groups founded on either location or group affiliation, who knows? So I wanted to offer a small activity here for folks if you're interested. Take a few minutes to write down or think about as many communities as you can that you're part of. And how do those communities start really big and then get smaller? And there might even be spots where there's overlap. I shared my own community bubbles here as an example. I could add so many more, but this is a small example from just a little bit of trying to go off the different communities I feel I'm part of. For example, I'm part of the community of women, which is half of the world. And then as we get smaller, I'm a sister, I'm an aunt, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I am married. And so I'm part of all of those communities as well. If we shift geographically, I grew up in Prince Edward Island, specifically in a very tiny, tiny country town called Freetown on a farm, and it was rural. So I'm part of all of those communities. And now I live in Halifax, and I live in Fairview, which is a smaller community within Halifax. And you can start seeing how I'm able to parse out these communities smaller and smaller. I have my education in there, both where I've gone to university, and then in thinking about some overlap in the type of work that I do, I love to do research, which also has added to my student status. And so this has been an overlap one to show how my communities sometimes bridge one another and come together. I really like this activity because I find it can help show you, especially if you've been feeling lonely or disconnected or isolated, it's an opportunity to go, oh, look at all of these spaces where I do belong, that I am part of. Even if I might not be getting together on a Zoom call with all women every Wednesday night, not so much a thing, right? To at least know somewhere up here that that's a community that I'm part of and it's an experience that I share with so many other people is something that I'm really grateful for. This is a chance for you to think through these communities that you're part of, how they get smaller, and maybe even where you want to go or the communities you want to become part of eventually. And this can help you both brainstorm and envision yourself there. In thinking about those communities though, let's make sure to get a little more specific. So think about where you fit in your communities. What do you contribute? Are you a leader or are you a follower? Are you a teacher or a student? What skills do you bring? And with these questions, these can change depending on those tiny relationships that you have that make this entire network of community. When I go to work, I teach in front of a classroom. And so in that sense, I'm a teacher. But then I go and I might be learning about something for my job within a workshop that same afternoon. And so my own roles are going to fluctuate within my community in really important ways. And as long as you are contributing to your community simply by existing, it's also valuable that you are getting support back. Do you have access needs or transportation needs? Do you have relationships with your neighbors or community members? And these are questions I think are that are really important for people living with disabilities. If you're living in a place that's particularly inaccessible, if you're living in a city where the transportation is particularly challenging. I know that there have been struggles over the last few years in Halifax, or probably even longer, regarding clearing sidewalks in winter, for example. And so how are our communities showing up for one another? These are important questions to be asked. So then we shift into thinking about community problems. So I wonder, what makes a community unhealthy? So you can't necessarily go and like try to control a community's Facebook page. That's a little different. It's a broader series of interconnected relationships and interconnected issues. But I'd love if folks could brainstorm a little bit. What do you think would make a community unhealthy? Or what do you think might affect community health?
Government?
Yeah, definitely it could, depending on which government, depending on the types of policies they put in place. It could also depend on who it's affecting, right? Because a government might put in one policy that supports one group but harms another. And that's a really great example. Things that might affect the community's health could include infrastructure problems. So things like not having sidewalks, crumbling roads, or poor signage. It could be belonging problems, things like rival groups, a lack of togetherness, or racism, sexism, and ableism issues. Poverty. If a community is underfunded, it cannot afford the things a resident might need. Is that depending on the government, how are they supporting the infrastructure? How are they supporting social programs to create more sense of belonging? And how is poverty being addressed, right? Food security, things like that. A lack of services even, fewer schools, stores, or supports. There are lots of ways that communities can have issues. I'm sure there are lots of examples that come to mind as people are considering this. So it's good to think about what problems may exist in your own communities. I know no sidewalks is an issue in my own. That's why it came up for me whenever I was making this. There's no sidewalk along my side of the road that I live on. And it's something that stresses me out. People trying to get to a bus stop with no sidewalk. If anybody has a wheelchair, I'm not sure how they get to that bus stop. It's something that frustrates me about my community. And I think that if I work on developing better relationships within my community, I could also help support that change. But in order to do that, I need to kind of start smaller with these individual relationships I'm working on building. If there are any other problems that exist in your communities that you think could be, something to do with these issues, that could be, that could have to do with an unhealthy community or a lack of community health, I'm certainly happy to hear about them. And also making sure that we're thinking about what changes could be made to help fix these problems. So thinking about not only what the problems are, but thinking about what we could do to fix them. That's key as well. Circles of closeness, this is like a really nice way to visualize this level of intimacy or the ways that we might choose to let people into our lives. I would have had this up higher with relationships, but I also wanted to talk about it within a community framework because there's you as the individual, and that is sort of the most intimate relationship you could ever have. And hopefully it's a healthy one. But that's a really nice reminder that your relationship with you should be number one. And how are you looking to foster the health of that relationship first? And then it broadens into perhaps more intimate relationships. This could be romantic, it could be family, it could be really close friendships. And these are the people you let in a little bit more. Maybe they know some deep secrets. Maybe they're people that you call for emergencies when you're feeling low. And as it broadens out, your community is often made of people all the way out to this very, very wide circle of even people you just met. When I'm out and about in my community, I'm passing people on the street. I'm passing people in the store I might never see again. The person that I honked at because they were driving dangerously, they're in my community, And so how that we're interacting with one another, it all has this ripple effect. And I really like how this image almost looks like that ripple effect. So having that healthy relationship with yourself and your close, intimate friends or family, and then allowing that to continue rippling out is just going to help support the development of our healthier communities as we continue on our own journeys of growth. We need to think about support networks. Who supports you? And who do you support? Why are support networks so important? And how do communities function as support networks? These are all questions that pertain to things we've talked about so far. But I want to shift to the final piece of our workshop today in talking about relationships and disability. It's really important to consider how relationships are impacted by disability, and also to consider some of the assumptions that people might have made about you or other people with disabilities and their ability to do things. I find that there are a lot of internalized, internal, in our head stigmas about people who live with disability. And here at Independent Living Nova Scotia, we do work across disabilities, which means that we support anyone who lives with a disability, regardless of what it is. But also, this means that we need to consider how folks of varying disabilities might have different and unique relationship challenges, whether that's through the development of social skills or perhaps physical barriers that make it harder to connect with people, in ways that we can support that. So if we're thinking about relationships and disability, you have the right to have relationships that are supportive, mutually beneficial, and that fulfill different types of needs. For example, family and friendship and romantic and work. Stereotypes add to the difficulty and stigma experienced by individuals with disabilities, and the following myths about individuals with disabilities have been identified. For example, individuals with disabilities don't need romantic relationships to be happy. This is a myth. Individuals with disabilities are not sexually attractive. Individuals with disabilities are oversexed. Individuals with disabilities have more important needs than romance. Individuals with disabilities don't need sex education. Or people with disabilities can't have real sex. But those are all myths. And the fact that people with disabilities have relationships that are as unique, individual, and personal as anyone else, and deserve the same rights to choose. With Independent Living Nova Scotia, our mission is that people with disabilities have choice and control, and it has to extend to all areas of life, including the development of relationships, no matter what kind. It's important that we challenge stereotypes. People with disabilities have challenged stereotypes, for example, noting that sexual relations aren't always about procreation, or the reminder that not all impairments are inheritable, even that many disabled people are perfectly happy accepting their impairment and the possibility that it might be passed on. That is okay. For example, deaf people consider deafness to be a culture rather than an impairment and believe it should be embraced and celebrated. So when we talk about disability and relationships, it is really important that we think about the work and the voices of disabled people within these conversations. And in the words of disability activists who coined the phrase, nothing about us without us. That's really important. There's some really cool local advocacy that is happening for people with disabilities and thinking about healthy relationships. The Tetra Society of North America, Atlantic, has partnered with Venus Envy Halifax to develop prototypes for sex toys that are accessible to people with disabilities. As well, Autism Nova Scotia runs a healthy relationships program for young adults and provides support with developing social skills and understanding of sexuality. So this is a great option for folks who are autistic. There are often other examples here as well. Venus Envy hosts lots of workshops that are very accessible, but these are kind of some things that I wanted to bring up for this specific topic. As well for some international advocacy, but Enhance the UK is a wonderful nonprofit that supports people living with disabilities and their families to live independently and make independent choices. And they created this video as a way to showcase people with disabilities as human beings with desires, same as everyone else. So this is part of a larger group of campaigns that have been happening internationally over the past few years, where people with disabilities are photographed, for example, in things like lingerie or in places that make them feel really powerful. And it's a really great opportunity for people with disabilities to say like, hey, I'm sexy and I deserve to have relationships that are fulfilling and meaningful. So this is a really cool thing. I highly recommend folks checking it out if they would like to learn more. When we think about healthy relationships, it is extremely important that we also talk about consent. Talking about what you want and don't want, as well as respecting your partner's boundaries, doesn't have to be serious, scary, or awkward. Consenting and asking for consent means that everyone is being upfront about their wants and needs, and that their partners are respecting each other's limits. Consent is going to apply to every relationship you have. A lot of people tend to think about consent only with romantic relationships and with, maybe somebody has been out drinking, and it's more about like whether someone is able to consent. But it's really important to talk about consent with every relationship, because that is how you're going to help people practice the ability to say yes or no before they get into a situation that makes them uncomfortable. For example, people with disabilities tend to have their boundaries crossed by people who haven't asked for consent. For example, an able-bodied person might move someone's wheelchair without asking. Another example could be an autistic person who does not like physical contact, may be forced to hug a relative. So consent is so valuable because just taking that extra moment to check in and ask the person before moving in to touch either them or something they own, a part of them, and that includes a mobility device, and really be groundbreaking in showing that they have the agency to make choices. So for example, even if you are wanting to get a hug, if I want to get a hug from my 5-year-old nephew, I say, hey, would you like to give Auntie a hug? And if he says no, I'm like, okay, no worries. Because, maybe in that moment he wasn't feeling it. Maybe he was excited about something and wanted to run. He couldn't stop and just give me a hug in that moment. And that's okay. And I think learning also to respect those boundaries is just as important as learning to set them. And that's why consent and teaching it is so, so important. It's important in all spaces, and it shows consideration for each person's boundaries and sense of peace. Sometimes someone might cross your boundaries by mistake. For example, maybe they thought you were sending a signal when you were not, or flirting when you were not. But sexual advances are often inappropriate. Sexual assault can happen to anyone of any age and gender, and it can be committed by anyone of any age and gender. And it's especially important that we're listening to people with disabilities when they're telling us about these things that might have happened to them. I really like this acronym over here in this image, FRIES. So if you ever need to remember the important points of consent, remember to think that it is freely given, that it is reversible, you can take it back at any time, that it's informed, it's enthusiastic, and it's specific. So I'm going to end here with some important reminders. And then a reminder that we are key players in creating our own healthy relationships. We cannot only be passive in the development of our relationships. We need to make sure we're being direct about what we want and need, and that we're asking others what they want and need to show that respect. Healthy relationships help create healthy communities. Often we need to start with that very small seed of either your relationship with you or your relationship with one other person. And we can see how those ripple effects come out to developing healthier, happier communities. It's important to remember that people with disabilities have the right to safe and healthy relationships. I have read stories, I have heard about people who have been told that they don't need sex education, that they don't need to learn about safer sex options because they have disabilities. And that's really wrong. And all it does is it keeps people in the dark and more susceptible to being hurt or to being assaulted or abused in whatever way. So Offering information in ways that's accessible, that's kind and supportive can really make a big difference in people with disabilities truly being able to make choices and have control over their lives. And finally, consent is required when touching another person. Ask and be sure to respect the answer. I want to thank you all for coming to this workshop today on healthy relationships and communities.